Two boots sat together under an old-growth fur heels touching the moss like someone had paused to pray. They were clean toe caps pointed straight north, and the air around them held the thin, sweet tang of sap and cold bark. The forest was still. Somewhere above, a camera strap tapped softly against a branch, the sound small as a wristwatch in a quiet room. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. Before the phone started ringing and the maps came out, my days at the Ohana Pekosh desk were measured in simple things: the hiss of the coffee urn, the door chime when a hiker pushed in from the morning chill, the way the river below the station sounded when the air warmed above 50 degrees. I'd retired from active fire seasons a few years earlier and picked up the desk job for the quiet, though in my experience, quiet can be a trickster. That October, the leaves along the highway were the color of pennies. Light held low and warm, and you could smell cedar in everything: the counters, the coats, even the paper forms. Packwood is a small place that runs on routine. Folks wave in traffic. The grocery store keeps the bananas by the front door because everyone stops for them on the way to trailheads. The lodge down the road serves pancakes the size of hubcaps and opens before dawn for climbers who like to start early. Mornings across the south side of Rainier feel like a shared promise. Boots tied snug thermos lids, tightened headlights fading from the lot as the mountain takes whoever's ready to listen. On that particular Friday, October 14th, I unlocked the station at 8:30 and flipped on the overheads one by one. The thermometer on the back wall read 64 degrees gentle for mid-fall, and the forecast was slow and steady light cloud cover, no storms, wind low enough to leave the tops of the firs barely moving. Ranger. Karen handed me the sign-in book and a stack of backcountry notices, and we settled into the easy rhythm we'd been working all season. By 9:40, we'd seen a pair of friends bound for the hot springs, a retired couple from Yakima holding a Polaroid of themselves here in '79, and a young man who couldn't remember if he'd left his pocket knife in his truck or his other truck. He came in just before 10, tall, spare, the careful kind of fit I recognize from years of watching people try to move through big country without making it mad. He set a mid-size pack against the counter and unrolled a folded map with 2 fingers, smoothing creases each time like he was apologizing to it. I've learned to see the difference between hikers who are courting the mountain and hikers who are visiting an old friend. He moved like the second kind. "Morning," I said, as I always do. "Where you headed?" He tapped the paper near a loop of contour lines, then lifted his gaze. Calm eyes, steady. "Thinking I'll start from Laughing Water," he told me, voice low, as if we might startle the room. "I'll keep it quiet." He wrote his name in the book, Daniel Whitaker, and the pen made that soft rasp across the page that a new refill makes. I noticed the camera, a solid Nikon hanging from a faded strap, and the way he kept his shoulders loose while he waited for me to pass him a conditions sheet. People who are anxious push their weight forward. People who know what they're doing stand like they've got time. Daniel had time. "Winds are light," I said, reading from the morning notes. "Creek crossings are low. Watch your footing on the shaded switchbacks, they'll stay slick all day." He nodded. I slid a folded sheet his way and he tucked it into a side pocket without glancing down the motion of someone who would read every line later, maybe with a headlamp and a careful thumb. There's a certain music to the station when it's working, right? The snap of a zipper, the squeak of wet rubber soles on linoleum radios murmuring 2 rooms over. In that music, people show you small truths. I watched Daniel adjust the waist belt on his pack and tighten one shoulder strap, not both, because he'd packed it so the heavier weight sat near the center of his back. He didn't ask about permits. He didn't need. He didn't over-talk to prove he knew the terrain. He slid a folded napkin from his jacket pocket, looked at it like he was reading a grocery list, only he could see, then put it back and smiled once. quick the way a person does when the thing they came to do finally lines up with the place they came to do it. "You headed past the campground or staying on the east side?" I asked. "East," he said. "I've got what I need." He meant the stove, the small tent, the meals that feel like hot salt when the air goes damp after dark. He meant a couple of power banks, a journal I didn't see, and the kind of patience that keeps you from chasing a ridge you shouldn't chase. I stamped the date on his sign-in line and wrote the time 9:58 a.m., because old habits die hard and I like to know exactly when a morning becomes memory. He thanked me and palmed the door open with the back of his hand. The river's breath met the room cooler than outside, carrying that rich mineral scent you only get near glacial water. Karen glanced over my shoulder as he left. "He'll be fine," she said. And I said sure, because he looked like the kind of man the woods recognize. In this corner of Washington, regulars cycle through the way birds do. There's Tom Ellison, who can fix a radio with a paper clip and a prayer rolling in with a half tank of gas and a grin that means he's already been up a ridge before breakfast. There's Mrs. Novak from Packwood, who brings us oatmeal cookies so you won't forget to eat, swatting our hands if we pretend we aren't hungry. And then there's Emily, who I didn't know that morning, not yet, but would come to know by her voice, clear, polite, threaded with steel, before the week was done. I took my lunch on the back steps, where the concrete holds the day's warmth, long after the sun slips behind the tree line. A jay scolded from the alder across the walk. You could hear tires on Highway 123 now, and then the sound flattened by distance. The thermometer climbed a notch and held. It was a day built for miles, shirt sleeves unhurried, breathing the forest floor spongy enough to keep your knees from complaining. Late afternoon always brings one or two who turned back early. A couple from Portland returned with a phone full of photos, mossy bridges, a single elk moving like smoke through the hemlocks, and a kid who'd worn new boots and learned something about blisters. Around 4, I stepped out to sweep pine needles off the entry mat and noticed a silver Subaru easing into a pull-through on the far side of the lot, then rolling on toward the campground. It registered as one more familiar shape in a day of familiar shapes. If you spend long enough at a trailhead, you can tell the difference between a vehicle that's just arrived and a vehicle that's saying goodbye. That one looked like both. Evening draws a curtain in this place. The light goes slate blue before it goes dark, and the river changes its voice by a half step, like it's moved to a lower key. Karen finished paperwork and locked the supply closet. I cleared the counter and lined up the pens the way my old crew boss used to line up drip torches before we rolled out. Everything in order means there's less to argue with tomorrow. I'm aware that sounds old-fashioned. I've earned that right. Down in Packwood, normal Friday rhythms clicked in a high school game under weak stadium lights. Pickup trucks angled along the fence, the grocery store manager pulling the last rotisserie chickens from the warmer and marking them down $6 for the night crowd. I drove through town with the window cracked and the heater on my feet radio low to catch the weather recap, still mild, still steady, and parked out back of my duplex where the neighbor's porch light always burns a little too bright. I ate leftover stew, sorted my mail, and set what my daughter calls the old man alarm on my watch for 5:30 a.m. I tell her the early hour keeps me honest. The truth is, it helps me sleep. You learn to feel the small seams in a day if you spend enough years reading terrain and weather. That night, a seam opened sometime after the evening news. It wasn't a sound so much as the absence of one. The wind outside had been nudging the maple leaves, and then it quit clean, like someone had pinched the air shut. I stood at the sink with a mug of tap water and watched steam from my breath fog the glass. Across the way, the lot was emptying, then still. I thought about the sign-in book and the neat line of names, the way people announce themselves to a place without realizing they've done it. In the morning, I unlocked the station just before dawn. The coffee urn hissed again. The river ran a shade louder with the overnight melt. A single pickup idled in the lot, exhaust drifting like cigarette smoke and then thinning to nothing. I refreshed the weatherboard high in the mid-60s again, and wrote the day's note about slick switchbacks in a heavier hand than usual. Karen came in with 2 paper bags from the bakery, set them down with a grin that said there were cinnamon rolls hiding inside, and told me she'd take first radio watch while I ran a bundle of maps to the kiosk by the campground. I passed Laughing Water on foot, the trailhead sign catching a bit of weak sun that had found its way through the trees. A crow dropped into the gravel and hopped twice head cocked, then lifted off without a sound. The lot held the usual mix mud on tires, dog noses on rear windows, a dark sedan with a pack leaning against the bumper like it had changed its mind. I stacked the maps topped off the pencils and adjusted the thumbtacks on the notice board so the corners sat flat. Back at the desk, we moved through the morning's traffic families, a pair of climbers counting rations out loud, a man on his first solo who asked the kind of questions that told me he'd be back for a second. Somewhere just before 9, the phones started early. Not frantic, not even urgent, just a few calls from the kinds of folks who live with one eye on the weather and the other on the clock. That's how a day can turn and not show you the turn until later. I signed out for lunch and walked the short path to the overlook above the river. The water there runs glassy for a moment, pool still, before it slides over a lip and braids itself into white. Sun hit the boulders in patches and lit the moss like bottle glass. I ate half a cinnamon roll. I listened. The forest gave me only what it wanted to give. That evening I drove home the long way past the quiet cabins on the upper road, where porch flags hang limp when the air has settled and where folks leave a light on the kitchen stove hood so anyone coming late can find their way without waking the house. I don't know why I noticed the small things. I noticed an empty driveway where there's usually a compact parked tight to the fence, a porch light burning earlier than usual. The suggestion of a note on a dashboard glimpsed through glass as I rolled past the trailhead. Not warnings exactly, just the kind of details a person files away without knowing where to put them. I turned into my lot, set the parking brake, and sat for a minute with the engine ticking itself cool. A thin mist had pooled along the edge of the road by then, ground-hugging the kind you can walk through without feeling it on your face. The maple leaves barely moved. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and gave up. I glanced at my watch out of habit, thinking about the sign-in book and the neat numbers I'd written there. On my kitchen counter, the landline sat heavy and patient beside a stack of mail. I straightened the bills, set my thermos by the sink for the morning, and flipped the porch light on out of routine more than need. It cast a small circle on the steps and reached halfway across the gravel, then stopped. I told myself I'd read for an hour and call it a night. The hour passed and the house kept its careful silence. I checked the clock again. The porch light hummed a little steady, as if it were waiting with me for something to pull into the dark and wash the front wall with headlights. Nothing did. I turned a page and listened for a phone that didn't ring. That night stretched long, the kind of quiet where every clock tick sounds heavier than it should. The porch light burned until dawn, casting that small pool of yellow over the gravel. But no car ever came down my drive. I was back at the ranger station by 7 the next morning, pouring the first cup of coffee when the phone rang. I remember the tone of the woman's voice before I registered her words, steady, polite, and trying too hard to stay calm. It was Emily Whitaker. She asked if we had record of her brother signing in the day before. I told her we did, that he'd logged in just before 10, heading for the Laughing Water Trail. There was a pause on the line, soft but heavy. Then she said he hadn't come home Sunday night. He hadn't called, not once. That was the moment the quiet began to change shape. Protocol says we wait 24 hours before calling a hiker missing unless there's clear sign of trouble, but everyone at Rainier knows how quickly things turn up there. By 9, Karen was on the radio to Search and Rescue Command, logging what we knew: a solo male 28 last seen Friday morning silver Subaru parked at the Laughing Water pullout. No itinerary left with family. I walked out to the lot and scanned the ridge like I always do when a case starts, just an old reflex, but all I saw was the same veil of fog rising off the trees, curling slow as breath. By mid-morning, the Park Service had confirmed the car. It sat tucked neat against the timberline exactly where he'd said he was headed. Doors locked, glass clean, no sign of struggle or storm damage. I met Ranger Pike there. The air was still a kind of hush you only hear before rain. She slid on gloves and popped the driver's door with the master key. Inside were snack wrappers, an empty water bottle, a map folded out across the dash, and a napkin that looked like it had been written on in a hurry. Be back Sunday night. Should be quiet. No one said it, but we all felt it, that word quiet, sitting there like a dare. We started the grid search the next morning. The first team went in with 2 dogs and thermal imaging support from the county chopper. I handled the radio log, marking every coordinate they covered. At first, everyone still had energy, calling in sightings of fresh tracks, bits of thread that might have been from a pack strap, a flash of color that turned out to be a beer can. The dogs caught scent near the creek bed, but it died within 50 yards. You could feel morale thinning by sunset. A second team pushed up the east switchbacks, and I drove out to meet them with supplies. The fog had dropped low by then, thick enough to bead on the hood of my truck. I saw their headlamps before I heard their boots. One of them, Tom Ellison, looked at me and shook his head. No campfire, no prints, nothing. That night we ate in the station kitchen. Nobody talked much. The sound of rain on the metal roof filled in the space where words should have been. I remember staring at the sign-in log, his handwriting clear as if he were still standing in front of me. D. Whitaker Ohanapecosh Loop, Friday, 9:58 a.m. I kept tracing the line with my thumb like maybe something would rise from the ink and tell me where he went. By Tuesday, the official missing person report went statewide. Emily drove up from Tacoma to meet us. I expected tears or anger, but she was composed, the kind of steady that comes from disbelief more than hope. We sat in the small office behind the ranger desk, her jacket still damp from the drive. She showed me a photo on her phone, Daniel standing in a patch of snow, the previous spring camera hanging at his side, that same quiet half-smile I'd seen at the counter. She said he'd been through a breakup earlier in the year, but was doing better hiking more, taking pictures, planning a photo series about solitude. He always checks in, she kept saying, even when he's late. Always. Search and rescue widened the radius that afternoon. The weather held still mild mid-60s, but we knew the nights were dropping close to freezing up high. Helicopters flew low over the ridges, blades echoing off the valley walls like distant thunder. I stayed at base logging coordinates, but each hour that passed felt longer, heavier. The mountain isn't cruel, it's indifferent. You can feel that indifference settle into your bones after a few days of hearing nothing back on the radio but static. Day 5 came and the language around the station started to shift. Folks still said rescue, but in quieter tones like they were already bracing for another word. Emily refused to leave, so Karen gave her a cot in the supply room and tried to keep her busy organizing volunteer lists. Every evening, she'd walk the line of maps tacked to the wall, tracing the red circles that marked our search zones as if maybe she'd feel something the rest of us missed. Sometimes I'd catch her standing outside the station, binoculars pressed to her chest, eyes on the tree line like she could will him to step out. By day 7, we had to bring in additional teams. The dogs were tiring, their paws cracking from the wet ground, and morale was low. Around mid-morning, a hiker came forward saying he'd seen someone matching Daniel's description the day he disappeared alone off-trail, moving steadily uphill away from the main path. Said the man looked focused, not lost. That was the first real lead we'd had, and it didn't make much sense. Experienced hikers stick to routes when they're solo, especially that far into October. Still, we logged the sighting and sent a crew to that ridge. They found nothing but moss and mist. Every night I'd drive home to Packwood, shower off the mud, and sit at the kitchen table staring at my own boots by the door. I thought about the way he'd smiled that single quiet nod before stepping out. You replay the moment 100 times, wondering if you missed some signal, an edge in the voice, a hesitation, something small that could have told you this wasn't just another weekend hike. but there wasn't anything. He'd seemed steady grounded, the kind of man who understood how quickly a wrong step could cost you. 3 weeks in the command decided to scale back the daily searches. Officially, it was still active, but everyone knew the meaning behind the paperwork. The chopper runs were reduced volunteers rotated out, and we focused on recovery, not rescue. Emily didn't take it well. She asked me if the mountain ever gives anyone back. I didn't know how to answer. Sometimes it does, I told her, but not always the way you hope. She nodded, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, and I realized she wasn't asking about remains, she was asking if closure was even possible in a place that wide. Late that evening, after the last team came off shift, Tom dropped a muddy scrap on my desk, a torn section of nylon frayed at one end. He'd found it snagged on a branch near the lower ravine close to a patch of churned soil. We logged the coordinates and marked it on the map. Next morning, a stove fragment turned up at the same spot a small burner charred black same model Daniel's family said he carried. It was something, but not enough. No blood, no drag marks, no prints, just fragments. We sent them to the lab anyway, and they came back clean. No sign of struggle, no evidence of an animal attack. After a month, the search wound down to a skeleton crew. The mountains went quiet again, the way they always do when people stop shouting into them. Winter moved in soft first with mist, then with snow that erased what little we'd found. The case file on my desk thickened with paperwork, but thinned in promise. I kept his sign-in sheet under the plastic mat where my hand rested each morning, just his name and that timestamp, a reminder that he was real. Spring thaw brought a brief flurry of hope when a group of climbers reported seeing a faded blue tent far up a side ridge, but it turned out to be shredded tarp tangled in branches. After that, we stopped getting calls. Months stretched into a year. The world went on new hikers, new permits, the same cycle of lives moving in and out of those woods. But I never shook the sense that something about Daniel's disappearance was different. It wasn't just the lack of evidence. It was the precision of the nothing we found, like the forest had swallowed him and sealed the ground behind. Then in March, the next year, a new file hit my desk. Another missing hiker. Same profile, same age range, same general area near Mowich Lake. His name was Lucas Rearin. I read the report twice, my stomach turning as the details lined up too neatly. The same entry point, same kind of pack, same note left on a dashboard promising a Sunday return. We reopened Daniel's file and started mapping the two cases together. The grids overlapped right down to a 2-mile stretch below Tolly Peak, a rugged bluff few people ever climbed. I went out there with Tom that first week of May. Snow still clung to the shaded slopes, thin crusts breaking underfoot. The climb was hard even for us, the air sharp and clean. From the ridge you could see miles of unbroken pine clouds moving slow and heavy above the valley. There was beauty in it, but also a weight like standing inside something ancient that didn't care if you belonged. We left flagging tape and hiked back down before dusk. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both felt it the way sound seemed to die in that place before it reached your ears. A few days later, 2 climbers from Seattle were scaling that same bluff when they radioed something in. The dispatch didn't say much at first, just unidentified remains, possible human. I was back at the station when the call came through the static on the line, fading in and out with the wind. My chest tightened before I even heard the location. Tolly Peak. I knew. Everyone did. I drove out that evening, headlights carving through mist. The forest was damp and breathing pine and soil thick in the air. Rangers had already cordoned off the area. They were quiet eyes drawn upward toward the tree line. I followed their gaze and saw it something suspended high among the branches, too large to be debris, too deliberate to be an accident. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. The body was nearly 30 feet up, clothes faded to gray limbs, still the kind of still that comes only after time. Cold air sank from the branches, heavy with the scent of rot and sap. For a long moment no one moved. Then the lad ranger whispered, "It's him." And the woods around us went perfectly silent, as if the mountain had stopped to listen. I stood there until the light drained from the ridge. The recovery team would work through the night, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Somewhere below that tree, a pair of boots sat neatly side by side, their toes pointing north. I thought of the napkin note he'd left in his car. Should be quiet. He got his wish. When I finally started down the slope, the fog closed in behind me, swallowing the trail. I kept my flashlight low, its beam cutting a narrow path through the dark. The forest had grown heavier somehow, as if carrying a secret it wasn't ready to give up. I didn't look back, but I felt it, the sense that even after all this time, Daniel wasn't done telling his story. When they brought him down from that tree, the world seemed to move slower, like the forest was forcing us to feel every inch of the distance between where he'd been found and the ground beneath our boots. I stood back by the perimeter tape, watching the recovery team work in silence, their headlamps slicing through mist that clung low around the trunks. They used pulleys, ropes, and patience, every motion deliberate. Even after years of recovery scenes, this one had a different weight to it. There was something wrong about the air itself, as if the mountain was holding its breath. When the body finally reached the forest floor, I caught sight of the jacket, the faded navy I'd seen when he stood at my desk that morning. The name patch still clung to the inside collar tag, his handwriting faint where he'd marked it with laundry pen Whitaker. They flew him out by sling before daylight, the helicopter lifting straight through the trees. I stayed behind with Karen and Tom to photograph the site once the noise died. The light from our flashlights revealed a clearing that looked almost staged. No sign of struggle, no drag marks, no loose soil, nothing disturbed except the patch of moss flattened directly beneath where he'd hung. That's where we found his phone and driver's license laid side by side. The screen was cracked, the battery long dead. I remember Karen whispering, "Who does that?" Not in disbelief, but like a question she was afraid to hear answered. Back at the station, we boxed his belongings with gloved hands and logged each one his knife on the stove we'd matched from the fragment found months before, a small folding knife, the camera strap still looped around his shoulder. The paracord on his wrists wasn't tied tight, just enough to leave impressions in the leather of his sleeves. It didn't make sense, none of it did, but the evidence doesn't care if it makes sense. It just sits there quiet, waiting to be read by people who never get the full language. The next few days blurred. Detectives came up from the county, then the state, then a few plainclothes investigators who didn't introduce themselves but carried the kind of confidence that says federal. They treated the area like a puzzle with missing corners, each piece too clean to believe. The coroner called later that week, voice low, respectful. Cause of death, asphyxiation, consistent with hanging. Manner undetermined. That word always lands heavy. It's the bureaucratic way of saying we don't know how this happened, and maybe we never will. When Emily arrived to identify what she could, I waited outside the exam room. I could hear her breathing more than crying, the kind of sound people make when grief doesn't fit into tears yet. She didn't stay long. When she came out, she handed me a small notebook she'd found in Daniel's apartment weeks after he went missing. He kept track of routes, she said. You might want to see this. I flipped through the pages that night. Each line was neat clean. Mileage count sketches of valleys, notes about light and weather. But on the last page, the handwriting broke apart, loops, uneven ink darker where the pen must have pressed too hard. It read, "Silence isn't peace. It's something pretending to be." We turned the new evidence over to the detectives, and for a brief moment it felt like we might find a thread to pull. But the deeper they went, the stranger it became. There were no signs Daniel had planned to end his life bank accounts, untouched, rent paid in advance. No letters or goodbyes. His search history showed nothing unusual. No maps beyond the standard park routes. No purchases for climbing gear that could have explained how he'd gotten that high up a fur without leaving a trace of entry. The autopsy found no broken ribs, no contusions, no sign of a fall or fight. His boots, perfectly aligned at the base of the tree, were dry inside, as if they'd been taken off carefully, not in panic. And above him, nestled in the crook of a branch 20 feet higher than where he'd been hung, a junior ranger found a weathered plastic bag sealed tight. Inside were 6 pages from his field journal, water-stained but legible in his handwriting. I read them once before they were sealed into evidence. They started plainly enough notes about trails, about hearing noises he couldn't place, about the way certain trees seemed to hold still even when the wind moved others around them. By the 3rd page, the writing shifted short phrases, frantic, spacing words scrawled as if written in the dark. They're watching. Not all the trees, just the tall ones. Another line said, I thought I came here. I was brought. On the last page, if you find this, it's already too late. The investigators sent the papers to the Bureau for testing ink composition DNA, anything that might prove tampering, but the results came back clean. All Daniel, no one else. I sat with that for a long time. Out here, people whisper about the woods like they're alive. It's not superstition, it's respect. You can spend decades working these mountains and still feel watched now and then, like the trees lean in closer when you stop listening. But this was something else. It wasn't just folklore creeping in. It was a pattern, details too specific to dismiss. In the years I'd worked that district, there'd been other disappearances, a dozen unsolved at least. Most we could blame on weather, bad luck, or human error. But when you laid their maps together, the clusters formed a rough triangle between Paradise Carbon River and the high basin above Ohanapikosh, the same corridor where Daniel was found. Locals had a name for it long before the internet did. The Rainier Triangle. I used to roll my eyes when tourists brought it up, but now I wasn't sure. Emily asked me one night, sitting outside the station with a paper cup of coffee gone cold, if I believed any of it. The stories about lights in the trees, people hearing voices before they disappear. I told her I believed in 2 things, terrain and time. The terrain doesn't lie, and time erases everything else. She stared into the dark for a while before saying, Then how do you explain his phone and ID laid out like that, like someone arranged them for you to find? I didn't have an answer. The official investigation dragged on through the summer. The file grew thicker, filled with photos, lab results, witness statements, and maps that looked like spiderwebs. The more we added, the less it made sense. We found no ladder marks, no rope burns on the branches above, no footprints in the soft soil. It was as though he'd appeared in that tree already suspended, untouched by gravity or logic. One agent theorized he might have climbed from a nearby slope using an improvised rope, then hung himself deliberately. But even that fell apart under scrutiny. The slope was sheer rock, slick with moss, impossible to climb without equipment. And Daniel's hands showed no cuts, no rope burn, no callus fresh enough to suggest recent climbing. After weeks of interviews, the federal team packed up and left. The case was officially listed as closed cause undetermined. But in towns like ours, nothing really closes. Word spreads through coffee counters, hunting stores, and Friday night bar chatter. Some folks claimed they'd seen faint lights near Tolly Peak the week he disappeared. Others swore they'd heard low humming in the trees like a generator buried underground. One old logger told me, "That part of the mountain don't like being disturbed." I didn't argue. You learn not to with men who've worked timber longer than you've been alive. Emily stopped coming by after August. She told me she needed distance, said every time she drove past the park sign it felt like the air got heavier. Before she left, she asked me to mail her a copy of the final report, even though I warned her there'd be more questions than answers. "That's all I've had since it started," she said. "Might as well have them on paper." She hugged me before she got in her car. It was brief but firm, the kind that says thank you and goodbye at the same time. By early fall, the chatter online had started. Podcasts, forums, people dissecting every theory imaginable. Some said Daniel staged it, wanted to vanish, and built a story so strange no one would question it. Others whispered about cults, about sacrifices or rituals in the backcountry. And then there were the ones who talked about something older than any of us, a presence in the forest that collects people the way the ocean takes ships. I never engaged with any of it. But I listened, because even stories that sound like nonsense usually start somewhere true. A few months later, 2 more hikers went missing near that same quadrant, both solo, both experienced. Neither case made national news. They rarely do anymore. But around here, folks noticed. Same weather pattern, same time of year, same silence afterward. Search teams found nothing, not a footprint, not a torn strap. The forest had swallowed 2 more names, quiet as ever. Every morning since I still unlock the ranger station, flip on the same lights, pour the same coffee sign, the same forms. But there's a moment each day right before dawn when the fog drifts down from the ridge and settles along the road. In that light, the trees look like figures tall, still half seen. I tell myself it's just the air playing tricks, but part of me wonders if Daniel saw something similar before he disappeared, something that felt like recognition. The official report calls his death undetermined. To me, it's unfinished. There's a difference. Files can be closed, but the silence around them keeps talking. And out there beyond the trailhead where the asphalt turns to dirt, the forest waits the same way it always has. Quiet, patient, holding on to its own explanations. Sometimes, when I'm locking up at night, I hear faint clicks from the tree line. Could be branches settling. Could be nothing. But every time I glance toward the ridge where they found him, half expecting to see that same dull glint of rope swaying between the branches, nothing's ever there. Just the woods breathing, and the sense that one day they'll call again asking for another file, another name to add to the list. That's how it is with places like Rainier. You don't conquer them. You coexist until they remind you who's in charge. Daniel's case reminded me. And as I drove home that night, headlights cutting through the fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain wasn't done with us yet. The day after the federal team pulled out, I drove back up to Tully Peak alone. I told Karen it was to collect the last of the perimeter markers, but truthfully, I just needed to stand in that clearing once more without the noise of generators and flash cameras. The morning was bright, but cold, the kind of cold that eats the sound out of the woods. The trail had been trampled flat by a week of boots, yet the forest felt untouched, as though all that activity hadn't mattered. When I reached the base of that Douglas fir, I looked up through the branches until I couldn't anymore. The ropes were gone, the tape too, yet the place still carried the shape of him, an absence with edges. The ground smelled of resin and damp earth. I knelt where his boots had been found, 2 faint impressions still visible in the moss side-by-side toes north. It seemed impossible that a man could go through all that and still leave a scene so clean, so deliberate. The FBI might have closed their file, but the case hadn't closed on me. I walked the perimeter slowly, touching bark marking distance. Every branch above 30 feet was stripped smooth from wind, no footholds anywhere. I found no drag marks, no sign of ladders or pulleys, nothing human. And yet something had placed him there. I thought about how often I'd told hikers that the forest wasn't out to hurt anyone, that it just didn't care one way or another. Standing there, I wasn't sure I still believed that. 2 days later, the lab results arrived from the evidence bag. Daniel's handwriting. Daniel's fingerprints, no contamination. But the ink used on those 6 pages wasn't from any pen we'd found among his belongings. A small detail easily dismissed, yet it stuck with me. He'd written those pages with something else somewhere else. When I told Karen, she frowned, said it might have been a replacement pen from his tent, but there'd been no tent found. Just fragments of stove, bits of nylon, and those pages sealed high in a branch above his body, far out of reach. That night, I pulled the old case files from the cabinet, other disappearances within that same triangular stretch of mountain. Names I hadn't looked at in years. a college student, a retired surveyor, two hunters who'd vanished only a mile apart, but 3 years apart in time. I spread the maps across my kitchen table and began marking them. Their last known points all fell within the same few square miles of steep forested terrain, the same general area where Daniel was found. I stared at those red pins until sunrise, then drove them straight to the sheriff's office. The detective on call, a man named Harlan who'd been through his share of bodies, flipped through the notes with a tired shrug. "Coincidence," he said. "Bad weather corridor, unstable slopes. Mountains take people all the time." But even he paused when I showed him the coordinates. "That's close," he muttered. "Too close." He promised to cross-check it with other files, but I could see it in his eyes. This was the kind of pattern nobody wanted to admit existed. Officially, randomness is safer than a reason you can't name. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. There were new hikers, new permits, and summer tourists rolling in with cameras and picnic coolers, unaware of anything older than their weekend. But small things kept circling back. A maintenance worker said he'd found candle wax dripped along a narrow game trail near the ridge. Tiny pale spots hardened to the bark like someone had left them there deliberately. Another ranger reported hearing faint knocking sounds near dusk, measured like Morse code, but too slow to mean anything. Normally I'd laugh that kind of talk off. Now I just noted it and said nothing. I saw Emily again in late September. She came by unannounced, her car parked crooked in the lot, the same dust from the highway still clinging to her windows. She didn't want updates, just a place to stand. We walked the short path behind the station where the pines open onto a clearing above the river. The air was cool, the water low. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo Daniel at age 10 standing beside a tent his father had pitched in their backyard, both smiling at the camera. "He used to say the woods were the only place that felt honest," she said. "Do you think they still are?" I told her I didn't know. It was the truth. The next morning, a news alert came across the ranger frequency. Another missing hiker male 32, last seen heading for the same loop near Mowich Lake. His name was Lucas Rearin. The call came from his girlfriend after he missed a Sunday check-in. It was the same story all over again. Solo hiker experienced no distress beacon car parked neatly at the trailhead. We all felt the weight of it before anyone said a word. When the search began, I joined the first wave. The ground was still soft from early rain, and fog clung low thick enough to muffle our own voices. We followed a ridge path lined with fresh growth about a mile east of where Daniel's car had been found 2 years earlier. Halfway up the slope, Tom spotted something pale against the dirt, a nylon strap torn clean through. The same brand of pack Daniel had used. It could have been coincidence, but the odds felt cruel. We logged it, bagged it, and kept moving. 3 days into the search, we brought in drones. They mapped the area from above, sending back grid after grid of green and gray. On the 5th morning, one of the pilots noticed something odd, a faint clearing on the upper bluff almost perfectly circular, as if a cluster of trees had been stripped bare from the center outward. The coordinates put it only half a mile from where Daniel's body had hung. I hiked there with 2 others. The incline was brutal loose rock underfoot branches grabbing at our sleeves. When we reached the clearing, we found nothing but a patch of flattened moss and a faint smell sharp and sour like metal left out in the rain. We stood there listening the way you do when you're not sure what you're listening for. Then from somewhere far off, 3 distinct clicks spaced evenly apart. Could have been woodpeckers. Could have been wind knocking branches together. But it sounded deliberate. We stayed another few minutes, radios quiet, before heading back down. None of us said a word on the descent. By mid-October, Lucas's case was folded into Daniel's, both marked open, but inactive. The official explanation remained the same: lost exposure possible. Accident remains not recovered. But the pattern was undeniable now, even if nobody wanted to admit it. Same region, same season, same vanishing silence. I stopped taking the forest's calm at face value. Even on clear days, I felt something under it, a stillness that wasn't rest. I started keeping notes of my own coordinates, times temperatures, anything that might show a rhythm to it all. Late one night, I pulled the evidence photos again and noticed something that had nagged at me from the beginning. The way Daniel's ID and phone had been placed beneath him, centered perfectly on that patch of moss. I laid a map over the image and aligned north. His boots, too, faced that direction. The line they formed pointed straight toward the same ridge where Lucas disappeared. It could have been nothing, but after everything else, coincidence didn't comfort me anymore. Winter came early that year. Heavy snow shut down half the park by Thanksgiving. I took the closure shift, checking gates, securing signs. Most nights were uneventful, just wind pushing against the truck doors and the sound of branches cracking under ice. But one evening near Tolly Peak, I stopped to chain the lower gate and noticed faint light moving in the trees uphill. It wasn't a flashlight, not that steady. It flickered low, then disappeared. I waited, radio in hand, but no call came through. The light returned once more, a pale pulse behind the pines, and then it was gone. I told myself it was a reflection from a distant headlamp, though I knew no one was up there. When I got home, I sat in the dark kitchen, boots still on, listening to the house creak as the heat kicked in. I thought about Daniel's journal, about that one line that had never stopped echoing in my head. I thought I came here. I was brought. 2 weeks later, Karen forwarded me the final coroner's supplemental report, the last piece of official paperwork on the case. It added nothing new. No evidence of foul play, no toxins, no trauma. But at the bottom of the page, beneath all the standard language, the coroner had added a note in small, slanted handwriting, unresolved, hanging consistent with human placement method unknown. That was as close as any of them would come to saying it. Sometimes I drive up that way still, even when I don't have to. The forest has a way of pretending it's unchanged, but once you've seen where the line between normal and impossible starts to blur, you can't look at it the same. There's a quiet at Tolly Peak that doesn't belong to weather. It's heavier, like a held breath that's never released. And lately I've started to hear things again on the radio during night patrol, faint static that clicks 3 times before cutting off. Always 3. Always in the same range. The dispatcher says it's interference from a nearby repeater. Maybe it is. But part of me can't shake the thought that the mountain is answering in its own language, one we still haven't learned to translate. I told myself I was done with the case. I wasn't. Because every silence now feels familiar. Every still moment carries the same weight it did the day they brought him down from that tree. And I know deep down that whatever happened to Daniel Whitaker didn't end there. The forest doesn't give back by accident. It waits until it's ready. And the way the nights have sounded lately, thicker, closer, full of small, measured knocks, I'm beginning to think it's almost ready again. It's strange how silence can outlive everything. The searches, the noise, the questions, all of it fades, but the quiet never really leaves. After those winter nights at Tolly Peak, when the clicks on the radio finally stopped, life went back to what people call normal. The trails reopened in the spring. The tourists returned with their bright jackets and hiking poles, and I went back to checking permits and giving weather updates. From the outside, it looked like the mountain had forgotten what it had taken, but anyone who'd been there knew better. The Whitaker file still sits in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't open it much anymore, though. Every now and then, when a new name gets added to the list of missing, I'll slide it out just to remind myself that silence doesn't mean finished. The photos inside are starting to fade. The moss looks grayer, the tree less imposing, but the feeling of that place hasn't dulled. Neither has the sound of the helicopter that morning when they lifted him away. That's the part I can't seem to shake. For a while I tried to make sense of it like an investigator would patterns, coordinates, cause and effect. But the longer I carried it, the more I realized it was never going to line up that neatly. The official paperwork still reads the same cause of death: asphyxiation, manner undetermined. It's the kind of line that lets the world move on while leaving the people closest to it stuck in place. Emily never fought that ruling. She told me once that answers didn't matter as much as acknowledgement, that she just wanted people to remember her brother as more than the man in the tree. She left Washington last summer, sent me a postcard from Arizona, a photo of open desert red and gold in the morning light. On the back, she'd written, "It's quiet here, but a different kind." That was all. I think she needed to find a kind of silence that didn't carry echoes. The park installed a new sign that same year just before the turnoff to the Ohanapecosh Trail. It's simple, a bronze plaque bolted to a cedar post. It reads, "In memory of those still lost to these woods. May we listen as closely as we look." I helped drive it into the ground. A few of the rangers came out, and Tom said a few words that trailed off halfway through. Nobody clapped. We just stood there until the sun dropped low enough that the metal caught at the reflection so bright you couldn't look straight at it. After that, hikers started leaving small things at the base of the sign stones, folded notes, sometimes pine cones stacked in neat towers. No one says who puts them there, but they're always gone by the end of each week, replaced by new ones. Maybe wind takes them. Maybe someone else does. Either way, it feels like a conversation the forest is having with itself. In the months after Daniel's body was found, more reports trickled in, not disappearances, not exactly, just odd things. A camera discovered on a log with no owner, a boot print leading to nowhere. Once a park volunteer swore she saw a figure standing deep in the tree line near dusk, perfectly still, facing north. I didn't file that report. Some things don't need to become paperwork. I've spent most of my life out here. Fought fires, patched trails, cleared fallen timber. The land teaches you patterns, how wind travels through canyons, how the ground softens before rain, how animals move when storms are coming. But what happened to Daniel didn't follow any pattern I've known. It wasn't chaos either. It was precise, careful, almost intentional. And that's what unsettles me most, because intention implies presence, and presence means we're not as alone as we think. Still, I keep my routines. Every morning I unlock the ranger station, pour that burnt coffee sign, my name on the sheet. The days move quiet now. The new staff are younger, more eager to explain everything with data and devices, and I don't correct them. There's no sense arguing with optimism. I envy it, to be honest. Sometimes when the fog rolls in from the river, it swallows the station whole. You can't see the road, can't hear the highway. Just the low hum of the forest breathing. That's when I think about the first time Daniel walked through those doors, polite, focused, a man who wanted peace more than anything. And how peace in its truest form is never loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in this way mist does until you can't tell where the air ends and you begin. I've stopped trying to define what happened. There are explanations that make sense on paper: psychological breaks, exposure, maybe even foul play hidden too well to trace. And then there's everything else, the unprovable, the way certain places hold on to certain kinds of people. It's easier now to let both truths exist side by side. The rational and the impossible, the seen and the felt. A few months back, I hiked up to that clearing again. The climb's harder these days. My knees don't like the grade. The tree still stands, older, rougher bark, darkened by time and weather. The moss has reclaimed the spot where the boots once sat. I stayed there a while, long enough for the light to change color, the forest turning that deep green that almost looks black. I thought about how many lives had touched that place, Daniel's, Emily's, ours, and how all of them had folded back into the same soil. As I started down, I caught myself counting my steps out loud. Not sure why. Maybe to keep rhythm. Maybe to remind myself that some of us are still walking. When I reached the bottom, I turned back once more. The light was fading fast, and for a second the top of that tree caught it glowing faintly gold, just like the plaque down below. For a moment, it looked almost alive. Back in town, people still talk about the Rainier Triangle, though mostly in the way folks talk about ghost stories, a little too loud, a little too certain. I don't correct them either. Let them have their myths. Sometimes myths are the only way people know how to hold on to something they can't explain. But for me, it's simpler. I think of Daniel as a man who went searching for quiet and found a kind that doesn't let go. There's a small shelf by the station window now where we keep items from recovered cases, rusted carabiners maps with penciled notes, fragments of stoves and straps. On the end sits a camera cleaned and sealed in glass. The Nikon we found on his shoulder. I asked to keep it there not as a relic, but as a reminder. The lens still works. You can twist it and feel the faint click of the focus ring. Sometimes, when the afternoon light hits just right, it throws a tiny reflection on the wall like a flash from somewhere far off. Visitors ask about it now and then. I just tell them, it belonged to someone who loved this place. That's true enough. The forest hasn't taken anyone since that winter. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's mercy. The trails are full again, and the laughter carries down the valley like it always has. But every so often, when the air drops still and the trees stop moving all at once, I think about how easily peace and danger trade places out here. How the same quiet that draws people in can just as easily hold them forever. I've learned that justice doesn't always come in the shape of arrests or verdicts. Sometimes it's just a family able to stop searching. Sometimes it's a story told out loud so the name doesn't fade. For Daniel, I think justice is memory, the way people still pause at that sign by the trailhead whispering a name even if they don't know why. I don't expect closure anymore. I've seen too many cases that never offered it. But there's something close to acceptance, and that's enough. The mountain remains what it's always been, ancient, patient, unmoved. And maybe that's the truest ending there is. Because no matter how many times we search its ridges, it will always keep its secrets a little deeper than we can reach. Every now and then, after closing, I'll sit out back of the station and listen. The river hums low steady. The air smells of cedar and smoke. And just before dark, if you pay attention, you can hear the faint creak of trees swaying high above. Slow, deliberate, like the forest is breathing again after holding still too long. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because sometimes remembrance is the only kind of light we have left.